The Eternal Haunter. This year, the Tokyo color prints, Nishiki-e, seem to me of unusual interest. They reproduce, or almost reproduce, the color charm of the early broadsides, and they show a marked improvement in line drawing. Certainly, one could not wish for anything prettier than the best prints of the present season. My latest purchase has been a set of weird studies, specters of all kinds known to the Far East, including many varieties not yet discovered in the West. Some are extremely unpleasant, but a few are really charming. Here, for example, is a delicious thing by Chika Nobu, just published, and for sale at the remarkable price of 3 sen. Can you guess what it represents? Yes, a girl. But what kind of a girl? Study it a little. Very lovely, is she not? With that shy sweetness in her downcast gaze, that light and dainty gaze as of a resting butterfly? No, she is not some Psyche of the most Eastern East, in the sense that you mean. But she is a soul. Observe that the cherry flowers falling from the branch above are passing through her form. See also the folds of her robe below, melting into blue faint mist. How delicate and vapory the whole thing is. It gives you the feeling of spring, and all those fairy colors are the colors of a Japanese spring morning. No, she is not the personification of any season. Rather, she is a dream. Such a dream as might haunt the slumbers of Far Eastern youth. But the artist did not intend her to represent a dream. She is a tree spirit, the spirit of the cherry tree. Only in the twilight of morning or of evening she appears, gliding about her tree, and whoever sees her must love her. But, if approached, she vanishes back into the trunk, like a vapor absorbed. There is a legend of one tree spirit who loved a man, and even gave him a son. But such conduct was quite at variance to the shy habits of her race. You ask, what is the use of drawing the impossible? Your asking proves that you do not feel the charm of this vision of youth, this dream of spring. I hold that the impossible bears a much closer relation to fact than does most of what we call the real and the commonplace. The impossible may not be naked truth, but I think that it is usually truth, masked and veiled perhaps, but eternal. Now to me, this Japanese dream is true at least as human love is, considered even as a ghost is true. Whoever pretends not to believe in ghosts of any kind lies to his own heart. Every man is haunted by ghosts, and this color print reminds me of a ghost whom we all know, though most of us, poets excepted, are unwilling to confess the acquaintance. Perhaps, for it happens to some of us, you may have seen this haunter in dreams of the night, even during childhood. Then, of course, you could not know the beautiful shape bending above your rest. Possibly you thought her to be an angel, or the soul of a dead sister. But in waking life, we first become aware of her presence about the time when boyhood begins to ripen into youth. The first of her apparitions is a shock of ecstasy, a breathless delight. But the wonder and the pleasure are quickly followed by a sense of sadness inexpressible, totally unlike any sadness ever felt before. Though in her gaze there is only caress, and on her lips the most exquisite of smiles. And you cannot imagine the reason of that feeling until you have learned who she is, which is not an easy thing to learn. Only a moment she remains, but during that luminous moment all the tides of your being set and surge to her with a longing for which there is not any word. And then, suddenly, she is not, and you find that the sun has gloomed and the colors of the world turned gray. Thereafter, enchantment remains between you and all that you loved before, persons or things or places. None of them will ever seem again so near and dear as in other days. Often she will return, Once that you have seen her, she will never cease to visit you. And this haunting, ineffably sweet, inexplicably sad, may fill you with rash desire to wander over the world in search of somebody like her. But however long and far you wander, never will you find that somebody. Later, you may learn to fear her visits because of the pain they bring, the strange pain that you cannot understand. But the breadth of zones and seas cannot divide you from her. Walls of iron cannot exclude her. Soundless and subtle as a shudder of ether is the motion of her. Ancient her beauty as the heart of man, yet ever waxing fairer, forever remaining young. Mortals wither in time as leaves in the frost of autumn, but time only brightens the glow and the bloom of her endless youth. All men have loved her. All must continue to love her, but none shall touch with his lips even the hem of her garment. All men adore her, yet all she deceives, and many are the ways of her deception. Most often she lures her lover into the presence of some earthly maid and blends herself incomprehensibly with the body of that maid, and works such sudden glamour that the human gaze becomes divine, that the human limbs shine through their raiment. But presently the luminous haunter detaches herself from the mortal and leaves her dupe to wonder at the mockery of sense. No man can describe her, though nearly all men have sometime tried to do so. Pictured she cannot be, since her beauty itself is a ceaseless becoming, multiple to infinitude, and tremulous with perpetual quickening, as with flowing of light. There is a story, indeed, that thousands of years ago some marvelous sculptor was able to fix in stone a single remembrance of her. But this doing became for many the cause of sorrow supreme, and the gods decreed, out of compassion, that to no other mortal should ever be given power to work the like wonder. In these years we can worship only, we cannot portray. But who is she? What is she? Ah, that is what I wanted you to ask. Well, she never had a name, but I shall call her a tree spirit. The Japanese say that you can exorcise a tree spirit, if you are cruel enough to do it, simply by cutting down her tree. But you cannot exorcise the spirit of whom I speak, nor ever cut down her tree. For her tree is the measureless, timeless, billion-branching tree of life, even the world tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots are in night and death, whose head is above the gods. Seek to woo her, she is echo. Seek to clasp her, she is shadow. But her smile will haunt you into the hour of dissolution and beyond, through numberless lives to come. And never will you return her smile, never, because of that which it awakens within you, the pain that you cannot understand. And never, never shall you win to her, because she is the phantom light of long-expired suns, because she was shaped by the beating of infinite millions of hearts that are dust, because her witchery was made in the endless ebb and flow of the visions and hopes of youth, through countless forgotten cycles of your own incalculable past. The Story of Mimi-Nashi-Hoichi. More than 700 years ago, at Dano-ura, in the Straits of Shimonoseki, was fought the last battle of the long contest between the Heike, or Terra clan, and the Genji, or Minamoto clan. There the Heike perished utterly, with their women and children, and their infant emperor likewise, now remembered as Antaku Tenno, and that sea and shore have been haunted for 700 years. Elsewhere I told you about the strange crabs found there, called Heike crabs, which have human faces on their backs, and are said to be the spirits of the Heike warriors. But there are many strange things to be seen and heard along that coast. On dark nights, thousands of ghostly fires hover about the beach or flit above the waves, pale lights which the fishermen call oni-bai, or demon fires. And whenever the winds are up, a sound of great shouting comes from the sea, like a clamor of battle. In former years, the Haike were very much more restless than they are now. They would rise about ships passing in the night and try to pull them down. It was in order to appease those dead that the Buddhist temple Amidaji was built at Akamagaseki. A cemetery also was made close by, near the beach, and within it were set up monuments inscribed with the names of the drowned emperor and of his great vassals, and Buddhist services were regularly performed there on behalf of the spirits of them. After the temple had been built and the tombs erected, the Haike gave less trouble than before, but they continued to do queer things at intervals, proving that they had not found the perfect peace. Some centuries ago, there lived at Akamagaseki a blind man named Hoichi, who was famed for his skill in recitation and in playing upon the biwa. From childhood, he had been trained to recite and to play, and while yet a lad, he had surpassed his teachers. As a professional biwa hoshi, he became famous chiefly by his recitations of the history of the Haike and the Genji. And it is said that when he sang the song of the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, even the goblins could not refrain from tears. At the outset of his career, Hoichi was very poor, but he found a good friend to help him. The priest of the Amidaji was fond of poetry and music, and he often invited Hoichi to the temple to play and recite. Afterwards, being much impressed by the wonderful skill of the lad, the priest promised that Hoichi should make the temple his home, and this offer was gratefully accepted. Hoichi was given a room in the temple building, and in return for food and lodging, he was required only to gratify the priest with a musical performance on certain evenings when otherwise disengaged. One summer night, the priest was called away to perform a Buddhist service at the house of a dead parishioner, and he went there with his acolyte, leaving Hoichi alone in the temple. It was a hot night, and the blind man sought to cool himself on the veranda before his sleeping room. The veranda overlooked a small garden in the rear of the Amidaji. There, Hoichi waited for the priest's return and tried to relieve his solitude by practicing upon his biwa. Midnight passed, and the priest did not appear, but the atmosphere was still too warm for comfort within doors, and Hoichi remained outside. At last, he heard steps approaching from the back gate. Somebody crossed the garden, advanced to the veranda, and halted directly in front of him. But it was not the priest. A deep voice called the blind man's name, abruptly and unceremoniously, in the manner of a samurai summoning an inferior. "Hoichi!" Hoichi was too much startled for the moment to respond, and the voice called again in a tone of harsh command. "Hoichi!" "Hi," answered the blind man, frightened by the menace in the voice. "I am blind. I cannot know who calls." "There is nothing to fear," the stranger exclaimed, speaking more gently. "I am stopping near this temple and have been sent to you with a message. My present lord, a person of exceedingly high rank, is now staying in Akamagaseki with many noble attendants. He wished to view the scene of the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, and today he visited that place. Having heard of your skill in reciting the story of the battle, he now desires to hear your performance, so you will take your biwa and come with me at once to the house where the august assembly is waiting." In those times, the order of a samurai was not to be lightly disobeyed. Hoichi donned his sandals, took his biwa, and went away with the stranger, who guided him deftly, but obliged him to walk very fast. The hand that guided was iron, and the clank of the warrior's stride proved him fully armored, probably some palace guard on duty. Hoichi's first alarm was over. He began to imagine himself in good luck, for, remembering the retainer's assurance about a person of exceedingly high rank, he thought that a lord who wished to hear the recitation could not be less than a daimyo of the first class. Presently the samurai halted, and Hoichi became aware that they had arrived at a large gateway, and he wondered, for he could not remember any large gate in that part of the town except the main gate of the Amadaji. "Kaimon," the samurai called, and there was a sound of unbarring, and the twain passed on. They traversed a space of garden, and halted again before some entrance, and the retainer cried in a loud voice, "Within there, I have brought Hoichi." Then came sounds of feet hurrying, and screens sliding, and rain doors opening, and voices of women in converse. By the language of the women, Hoichi knew them to be domestics in some noble household, but he could not imagine to what place he had been conducted. Little time was allowed for conjecture. After he had been helped to mount several stone steps, upon the last of which he was told to leave his sandals, a woman's hand guided him along interminable reaches of polished planking, and round pillared angles too many to remember, and over widths amazing of matted floor, into the middle of some vast apartment. There he thought that many great people were assembled. The sound of the rustling of silk was like the sound of leaves in a forest. He heard also a great humming of voices, talking in undertones, and the speech was the speech of courts. Hoichi was told to put himself at ease, and he found a kneeling cushion ready for him. After having taken his place upon it and tuned his instrument, the voice of a woman, whom he divined to be of the rojo, or matron in charge of the female service, addressed him, saying, "It is now required that the history of the Haiki be recited to the accompaniment of the biwa." Now the entire recital would have required a time of many nights. Therefore Hoichi ventured a question. "As the whole of the story is not soon told, what portion is it augustly desired that I now recite?" The woman's voice made answer, "Recite the story of the battle at Danuura, for the pity of it is the most deep." Then Hoichi lifted up his voice and chanted the chant of the fight on the bitter sea, wonderfully making his biwa to sound like the straining of oars and the rushing of ships, the whir and the hissing of arrows, the shouting and trampling of men, the crashing of steel upon helmets, the plunging of slain in the flood. And to left and right of him, in the pauses of his playing, he could hear voices murmuring praise. How marvelous an artist! Never in our own province was playing heard like this. Not in all the empire is there another singer like Hoichi. Then fresh courage came to him, and he played and sang yet better than before, and a hush of wonder deepened about him. But when at last he came to tell the fate of the fair and helpless, the piteous perishing of the women and children, and the death leap of Nino Ama, with the imperial infant in her arms, then all the listeners uttered together one long, long shuddering cry of anguish. And thereafter they wept and wailed so loudly and so wildly that the blind man was frightened by the violence and grief that he had made. For some time the sobbing and the wailing continued, but gradually the sounds of lamentation died away, and again, in the great stillness that followed, Hoichi heard the voice of the woman whom he supposed to be the Rojo. She said, "Although we have been assured that you were a very skillful player upon the biwa, and without an equal in recitation, we did not know that anyone could be so skillful as you have proved yourself tonight. Our Lord has been pleased to say that he intends to bestow upon you a fitting reward. But he desires that you shall perform before him once every night for the next 6 nights, after which time he will probably make his august return journey. Tomorrow night, therefore, you are to come here at the same hour. The retainer who tonight conducted you will be sent for you. There is another matter about which I have been ordered to inform you. It is required that you shall speak to no one of your visits here during the time of our Lord's august sojourn at Akamagaseki. As he is traveling incognito, he commands that no mention of these things be made. You are now free to go back to your temple." After Hoichi had duly expressed his thanks, a woman's hand conducted him to the entrance of the house, where the same retainer who had before guarded him was waiting to take him home. The retainer led him to the veranda at the rear of the temple, and there bade him farewell. It was almost dawn when Hoichi returned, but his absence from the temple had not been observed, as the priest, coming back at a very late hour, had supposed him asleep. During the day, Hoichi was able to take some rest, and he said nothing about his strange adventure. In the middle of the following night, the samurai again came for him and led him to the august assembly, where he gave another recitation with the same success that had attended his previous performance. But during this second visit, his absence from the temple was accidentally discovered, and after his return in the morning, he was summoned to the presence of the priest, who said to him in a tone of kindly reproach, "We have been very anxious about you, friend Hoichi. To go out blind and alone at so late an hour is dangerous. Why did you go without telling us? I could have ordered a servant to accompany you. And where have you been?" Hoichi answered evasively, "Pardon me, kind friend. I had to attend to some private business, and I could not arrange the matter at any other hour." The priest was surprised rather than pained by Hoichi's reticence. He felt it to be unnatural and suspected something worse. He feared that the blind lad had been bewitched or deluded by some evil spirits. He did not ask any more questions, but he privately instructed the men servants of the temple to keep watch upon Hoichi's movements and to follow him in case that he should again leave the temple after dark. On the very next night, Hoichi was seen to leave the temple, and the servants immediately lighted their lanterns and followed after him. But it was a rainy night and very dark, and before the temple folks could get to the roadway, Hoichi had disappeared. Evidently he had walked very fast, a strange thing considering his blindness, for the road was in a bad condition. The men hurried through the streets, making inquiries at every house which Hoichi was accustomed to visit, but nobody could give them any news of him. At last, as they were returning to the temple by way of the shore, they were startled by the sound of a biwa furiously played in the cemetery of the Amadaji. Except for some ghostly fires, such as usually flitted there on dark nights, all was blackness in that direction. But the men at once hastened to the cemetery, and there, by the help of their lanterns, they discovered Hoichi, sitting alone in the rain before the memorial tomb of Antoku Tenno, making his biwa resound and loudly chanting the chant of the Battle of Dan no Ura. And behind him and about him and everywhere above the tombs, the fires of the dead were burning like candles. Never before had so great a host of onibai appeared in the sight of mortal man. "Hoichi-san," the servants cried, "you are bewitched! Hoichi-san!" But the blind man did not seem to hear. Strenuously he made his biwa to rattle and ring and clang. More and more wildly he chanted the chant of the Battle of Dan no Ura. They caught hold of him. They shouted into his ear, "Hoichi-san, come home with us at once." Reprovingly he spoke to them. "To interrupt me in such a manner before this august assembly will not be tolerated." Whereat, in spite of the weirdness of the thing, the servants could not help laughing. Sure that he had been bewitched, they now seized him and pulled him up on his feet, and by main force hurried him back to the temple, where he was immediately relieved of his wet clothes by order of the priest. Then the priest insisted upon a full explanation of his friend's astonishing behavior. Hoichi long hesitated to speak, but at last, finding that his conduct had really alarmed and angered the good priest, he decided to abandon his reserve and he related everything that had happened from the time of the first visit of the samurai. The priest said, "Hoichi, my poor friend, you are now in great danger. How unfortunate that you did not tell me all this before. Your wonderful skill in music has indeed brought you into strange trouble. By this time you must be aware that you have not been visiting any house whatever, but you have been passing your nights in the cemetery among the tombs of the Heike, and it was before the memorial tomb of Antoku Tenno that our people tonight found you sitting in the rain. All that you have been imagining was illusion, except the calling of the dead. By once obeying them, you have put yourself in their power. If you obey them again after what has already occurred, they will tear you in pieces. But they would have destroyed you sooner or later in any event. Now I shall not be able to remain with you tonight. I am called away to perform another service. But before I go, it will be necessary to protect your body by writing holy texts upon it." Before sundown, the priest and his acolytes stripped Hoichi. Then, with their writing brushes, they traced upon his breast and back, head and face and neck, limbs and hands and feet, even upon the soles of his feet, and upon all parts of his body, the text of the Holy Sutra, called Hanya Shen Kyo. When this had been done, the priest instructed Hoichi, saying, "Tonight, as soon as I go away, you must seat yourself on the veranda and wait. You will be called, but whatever may happen, do not answer and do not move. Say nothing and sit still as if meditating. If you stir or make any noise, you will be torn asunder. Do not get frightened and do not think of calling for help, because no help could save you. If you do exactly as I tell you, the danger will pass and you will have nothing more to fear." After dark, the priest and the acolyte went away, and Hoichi seated himself on the veranda according to the instructions given him. He laid his biwa on the planking beside him, and, assuming the attitude of meditation, remained quite still, taking care not to cough or to breathe audibly. For hours he stayed thus. Then, from the roadway, he heard the steps coming. They passed the gate, crossed the garden, approached the veranda, stopped, directly in front of him. "Hoichi," the deep voice called. But the blind man held his breath and sat motionless. "Hoichi," grimly called the voice a second time, then a third time, savagely. "Hoichi!" Hoichi remained as still as a stone, and the voice grumbled, "No answer. That won't do. Must see where the fellow is." There was a noise of heavy feet mounting upon the veranda. The feet approached deliberately, halted beside him. Then, for long minutes, there was dead silence, during which Hoichi felt his whole body shake to the beating of his heart. At last the gruff voice muttered close to him, "Here is the biwa, but of the biwa player I see only 2 ears. So that explains why he did not answer. He had no mouth to answer with. There is nothing left of him but his ears. Now to my lord those ears I will take, in proof that the august commands have been obeyed so far as was possible." At that instant, Hoichi felt his ears gripped by fingers of iron and torn off. Great as the pain was, he gave no cry. The heavy footfalls receded along the veranda, descended into the garden, passed out to the roadway, and ceased. From either side of his head, the blind man felt a thick, warm trickling, but he dared not lift his hands. Before sunrise, the priest came back. He hastened at once to the veranda in the rear, stopped and slipped upon something clammy, and uttered a cry of horror, for he saw by the light of his lantern the clamminess was blood. But he perceived Hoichi sitting there in the attitude of meditation, with the blood still oozing from his wounds. "My poor Hoichi," cried the startled priest, "what is this? You have been hurt?" At the sound of his friend's voice, the blind man felt safe. He burst out sobbing and tearfully told his adventure of the night. "Poor, poor Hoichi," the priest exclaimed. "All my fault. Everywhere upon your body the holy texts have been written, except upon your ears. I trusted my acolyte to do that part of the work, and it was very, very wrong of me not to have made sure that he had done it. Well, the matter cannot now be helped. We can only try to heal your hurts as soon as possible. Cheer up, friend. The danger is now well over. You will never again be troubled by those visitors." With the aid of a good doctor, Hoichi soon recovered from his injuries. The story of his strange adventures spread far and wide and soon made him famous. Many noble persons went to Akamagaseki to hear him recite, and large presents of money were given to him, so that he became a wealthy man. But from the time of his adventure, he was known only by the appellation of Mimi-Nashi-Hoichi, Hoichi the Earless. Yuki-Onna. In a village of Musashi Province, there lived two woodcutters, Mosaku and Minokichi. At the time of which I am speaking, Mosaku was an old man, and Minokichi, his apprentice, was a lad of 18 years. Every day they went together to a forest situated about 5 miles from their village. On the way to that forest, there is a wide river to cross, and there is a ferry boat. Several times a bridge was built to cross where the ferry is, but the bridge was each time carried away by a flood. No common bridge can resist the current there when the river rises. Mosaku and Minokichi were on their way home one very cold evening when a great snowstorm overtook them. They reached the ferry, and they found that the boatman had gone away, leaving his boat on the other side of the river. It was no day for swimming, and the woodcutters took shelter in the ferryman's hut, thinking themselves lucky to find any shelter at all. There was no brazier in the hut, nor any place in which to make a fire. It was only a 2-mat hut, with a single door but no window. Mosaku and Minokichi fastened the door and lay down to rest, with their straw raincoats over them. At first they did not feel very cold, and they thought that the storm would soon be over. The old man almost immediately fell asleep, but the boy, Minokichi, lay awake a long time, listening to the awful wind and the continual slashing of the snow against the door. The river was roaring, and the hut swayed and creaked like a junk at sea. It was a terrible storm, and the air was every moment becoming colder, and Minokichi shivered under his raincoat. But at last, in spite of the cold, he too fell asleep. He was awakened by a showering of snow in his face. The door of the hut had been forced open, and by the snow light he saw a woman in the room, a woman all in white. She was bending above Mosaku and blowing her breath upon him, and her breath was like a bright white smoke. Almost in the same moment she turned to Minokichi and stooped over him. He tried to cry out, but found that he could not utter any sound. The white woman bent over him, lower and lower, until her face almost touched him, and he saw that she was very beautiful, though her eyes made him afraid. For a little time she continued to look at him. Then she smiled and she whispered, "I intended to treat you like the other man, but I cannot help feeling some pity for you, because you are so young. You are a pretty boy, Minokichi, and I will not hurt you now. But if you ever tell anybody, even your own mother, about what you have seen this night, I shall know it, and then I will kill you. Remember what I say." With these words, she turned from him and passed through the doorway. Then he found himself able to move, and he sprang up and looked out. But the woman was nowhere to be seen, and the snow was driving furiously into the hut. Minokichi closed the door and secured it by fixing several billets of wood against it. He wondered if the wind had blown it open. He thought that he might have been only dreaming, and might have forgotten the gleam of the snow light in the doorway for a figure of a white woman, but he could not be sure. He called to Mosaku and was frightened because the old man did not answer. He put out his hand in the dark and touched Mosaku's face and found that it was ice. Mosaku was stark and dead. By dawn, the storm was over, and when the ferryman returned to his station a little after sunrise, he found Minokichi lying senseless beside the frozen body of Mosaku. Minokichi was promptly cared for and soon came to himself, but he remained a long time ill from the effects of the cold of that terrible night. He had been greatly frightened also by the old man's death, but he said nothing about the vision of the woman in white. As soon as he got well again, he returned to his calling, going alone every morning to the forest and coming back at nightfall with his bundles of wood, which his mother helped him to sell. One evening in the winter of the following year, as he was on his way home, he overtook a girl who happened to be traveling by the same road. She was a tall, slim girl, very good-looking, and she answered Minokichi's greeting in a voice as pleasant to the ear as the voice of a songbird. Then he walked beside her, and they began to talk. The girl said that her name was Oyuki, and she had lately lost both of her parents, and she was going to Yedo, where she happened to have some poor relations who might help her to find a situation as a servant. Minokichi soon felt charmed by this strange girl, and the more that he looked at her, the handsomer she appeared to be. He asked her whether she was yet betrothed, and she answered laughingly that she was free. Then, in her turn, she asked Minokichi whether he was married or pledged to marry, and he told her that, although he had only a widowed mother to support, the question of an honorable daughter-in-law had not yet been considered, as he was very young. After these confidences, they walked on for a long while without speaking, but as the proverb declares, when the wish is there, the eyes can say as much as the mouth. By the time they reached the village, they had become very much pleased with each other, and then Minokichi asked Oyuki to rest a while at his house. After some shy hesitation, she went there with him, and his mother made her welcome and prepared a warm meal for her. Oyuki behaved so nicely that Minokichi's mother took a sudden fancy to her and persuaded her to delay her journey to Yedo. And the natural end of the matter was that Yuki never went to Yedo at all. She remained in the house as an honorable daughter-in-law. Oyuki proved a very good daughter-in-law. When Minokichi's mother came to die some 5 years later, her last words were words of affection and praise for the wife of his son. And Oyuki bore Minokichi 10 children, boys and girls, handsome children all of them, and very fair of skin. The country folk thought Oyuki a wonderful person, by nature different from themselves. Most of the peasant women age early, but Oyuki, even after having become the mother of 10 children, looked as young and fresh as on the day she had first come to the village. One night, after the children had gone to sleep, Oyuki was sewing by the light of a paper lamp, and Minokichi, watching her, said, "To see you sewing there, with the light on your face, makes me think of a strange thing that happened when I was a lad of 18. I then saw somebody as beautiful and white as you are now. Indeed, she was very like you." Without lifting her eyes from her work, Oyuki responded, "Tell me about her. Where did you see her?" Then Minokichi told her about the terrible night in the ferryman's hut, and about the white woman that had stooped above him, smiling and whispering, and about the silent death of old Mosaku. And he said, "Asleep or awake, that was the only time that I saw a being as beautiful as you. Of course, she was not a human being, and I was afraid of her, very much afraid. But she was so white. Indeed, I have never been sure whether it was a dream that I saw or the woman of the snow." Oyuki flung down her sewing and arose and bowed above Minokichi where he sat and shrieked into his face, "It was I, Yuki it was, and I told you then that I would kill you if you ever said one word about it. But for those children asleep there, I would kill you this moment. And now you had better take very, very good care of them, For if they ever have reason to complain of you, I will treat you as you deserve." Even as she screamed, her voice became thin, like a crying of wind. Then she melted into a bright white mist that spired to the roof beams and shuddered away through the smoke hole. Never again was she seen. Of a Promise Broken. "I am not afraid to die," said the dying wife. "There is only one thing that troubles me now. I wish that I could know who will take my place in this house." "My dear one," answered the sorrowing husband, "nobody shall ever take your place in my home. I will never, never marry again." At the time that he said this, he was speaking out of his heart, for he loved the woman whom he was about to lose. "On the faith of a samurai?" she questioned with a feeble smile. "On the faith of a samurai," he responded, stroking the pale, thin face. "Then, my dear one," she said, "you will let me be buried in the garden, will you not, near those plum trees that we planted at the further end? I wanted long ago to ask this, but I thought that if you were to marry again, you would not like to have my grave so near you. Now you have promised that no other woman shall take my place, so I need not hesitate to speak of my wish. I want so much to be buried in the garden. I think that in the garden I should sometimes hear your voice, and that I should still be able to see the flowers in the spring." "It shall be as you wish," he answered. "But do not now speak of burial. You are not so ill that we have lost all hope." "I have," she returned. "I shall die this morning, but you will bury me in the garden." "Yes," he said, "under the shade of the plum trees that we planted, and you shall have a beautiful tomb there." "And you will give me a little bell?" "Bell?" "Yes, I want you to put a little bell in the coffin, such a little bell as the Buddhist pilgrims carry. Shall I have it?" "You shall have the little bell, and anything else that you wish." "I do not wish for anything else," she said. "My dear one, you have been very good to me always. Now I can die happy." Then she closed her eyes and died, as easily as a tired child falls asleep. She looked beautiful when she was dead, and there was a smile upon her face. She was buried in the garden under the shade of the trees that she loved, and a small bell was buried with her. Above the grave was erected a handsome monument decorated with the family crest and bearing the Kimio, great elder sister, luminous shadow of the plum flower chamber, dwelling in the mansion of the great sea of compassion. But within 12 months after the death of his wife, the relatives and friends of the samurai began to insist that he should marry again. "You are still a young man," they said, "and an only son, and you have no children. It is the duty of a samurai to marry. If you die childless, who will be there to make the offerings and to remember the ancestors?" By many such representations, he was at last persuaded to marry again. The bride was only 17 years old, and he found that he could love her dearly, notwithstanding the dumb reproach of the tomb in the garden. Nothing took place to disturb the happiness of the young wife until the 7th day after the wedding, when her husband was ordered to undertake certain duties requiring his presence at the castle by night. On the first evening that he was obliged to leave her alone, she felt uneasy in a way that she could not explain, vaguely afraid without knowing why. When she went to bed, she could not sleep. There was a strange oppression in the air, an indefinable heaviness like that which sometimes precedes the coming of a storm. About the hour of the ox, she heard, outside in the night, the clanging of a bell, a Buddhist pilgrim bell, and she wondered what pilgrim could be passing through the samurai quarter at such a time. Presently, after a pause, the bell sounded much nearer. Evidently, the pilgrim was approaching the house. But why approaching from the rear, where no road was? Suddenly, the dogs began to whine and howl in an unusual and horrible way, and a fear came upon her like the fear of dreams. That ringing was certainly in the garden. She tried to get up to waken a servant, but she found that she could not rise, could not move, could not call. And nearer, still more near, came the clang of the bell. And oh, how the dogs howled! Then, lightly as a shadow steals, there glided into the room a woman. Though every door stood fast and every screen unmoved, a woman robed in a grave robe and carrying a pilgrim's bell. Eyeless she came, because she had long been dead, and her loosened hair streamed down about her face, and she looked without eyes through the tangle of it, and spoke without a tongue. "Not in this house shall you stay. Here I am mistress still. You shall go, and you shall tell to none the reason of your going. If you tell him, I will tear you to pieces." So speaking, the haunter vanished. The bride became senseless with fear. Until the dawn she so remained. Nevertheless, in the cheery light of day, she doubted the reality of what she had seen and heard. The memory of the warning still weighed upon her so heavily that she did not dare to speak of the vision, either to her husband or to anyone else. But she was almost able to persuade herself that she had only dreamed an ugly dream, which had made her ill. On the following night, however, she could not doubt. Again, at the hour of the ox, the dogs began to howl and whine. Again, the bell resounded, approaching slowly from the garden. Again, the listener vainly strove to rise and call. Again, the dead came into the room and hissed, "You shall go, and you shall tell to no one why you must go. If you even whisper it to him, I will tear you in pieces." This time, the haunter came close to the couch, and bent and muttered and moved above it. Next morning, when the samurai returned from the castle, his young wife prostrated herself before him in supplication. "I beseech you," she said, "to pardon my ingratitude and my great rudeness in thus addressing you, but I want to go home. I want to go away at once." "Are you not happy here?" he asked in sincere surprise. "Has anyone dared to be unkind to you during my absence?" "It is not that," she answered, sobbing. "Everybody here has been only too good to me. But I cannot continue to be your wife. I must go away." "My dear," he exclaimed in great astonishment, "it is very painful to know that you have had any cause for unhappiness in this house. But I cannot even imagine why you would want to go away. Unless somebody has been very unkind to you, surely you do not mean that you wish for a divorce." She responded, trembling and weeping, "If you do not give me a divorce, I shall die." He remained for a little while silent, vainly trying to think of some cause for this amazing declaration. Then, without betraying any emotion, he made answer. "To send you back now to your people without any fault on your part would seem a shameful act. If you will tell me a good reason for your wish, any reason that will enable me to explain matters honorably, I can write you a divorce. But unless you give me a reason, a good reason, I will not divorce you, for the honor of our house must be kept above reproach." And then she felt obliged to speak, and she told him everything, adding, in an agony of terror, "Now that I have let you know, she will kill me. She will kill me." Although a brave man and little inclined to believe in phantoms, the samurai was more than startled for the moment. But a simple and natural explanation of the matter soon presented itself to his mind. "My dear," he said, "you are now very nervous, and I fear that someone has been telling you foolish stories. I cannot give you a divorce merely because you have had a bad dream in this house. But I am very sorry indeed that you should have been suffering in such a way during my absence. Tonight, also, I must be at the castle. But you shall not be alone. I will order 2 of the retainers to keep watch in your room, and you will be able to sleep in peace. They are good men, and they will take all possible care of you. Then he spoke to her so considerately and so affectionately that she became almost ashamed of her terrors and resolved to remain in the house. The two retainers left in charge of the young wife were big, brave, simple-hearted men, experienced guardians of women and children. They told the bride pleasant stories to keep her cheerful. She talked with them a long time, laughed at their good-humored fun, and almost forgot her fears. When at last she lay down to sleep, the men-at-arms took their places in the corner of the room behind a screen and began a game of Go, speaking only in whispers that she might not be disturbed. She slept like an infant. But again, at the hour of the ox, she awoke with a moan of terror, for she heard the bell. It was already near, and was coming nearer. She started up, she screamed, but in the room there was no stir, only a silence as of death, a silence growing, a silence thickening. She rushed to the men-at-arms. They sat before their checker table, motionless, each staring at the other with fixed eyes. She shrieked to them, she shook them. They remained as if frozen. Afterwards, they said that they had heard the bell, heard also the cry of the bride, even felt her try to shake them into wakefulness, and that, nevertheless, they had not been able to move or speak. From the same moment they had ceased to hear or to see, a black sleep had seized upon them. Entering his bridal chamber at dawn, the samurai beheld, by the light of a dying lamp, the headless body of his young wife lying in a pool of blood. Still squatting before their unfinished game, the two retainers slept. At their master's cry, they sprang up and stupidly stared at the horror on the floor. The head was nowhere to be seen, and the hideous wound showed that it had not been cut off, but torn off. A trail of blood led from the chamber to an angle of the outside gallery where the storm doors appeared to have been riven apart. The three men followed that trail into the garden, over reaches of grass, over spaces of sand, along the bank of an iris-bordered pond, under heavy shadowings of cedar and bamboo. And suddenly, at a turn, they found themselves face to face with a nightmare thing that chippered like a bat. The figure of the long-buried woman, erect before her tomb, in one hand clutching a bell, and the other the dripping head. For a moment, the three stood numbed. Then one of the men-at-arms, uttering a Buddhist invocation, drew and struck at the shape. Instantly it crumbled down upon the soil, an empty scattering of grave rags, bones, and hair, and the bell rolled clanking out of the ruin. But the fleshless right hand, though parted from the wrist, still writhed, and its fingers still gripped at the bleeding head, and tore and mangled as the claws of the yellow crab cling fast to a fallen fruit. "That is a wicked story," I said to the friend who had related it. "The vengeance of the dead, if taken at all, should have been taken upon the man." "Men think so," he made answer, "but that is not the way that a woman feels." He was right. The Legend of Yurei-Daki. Near the village of Kurosaka, in the province of Hoki, there is a waterfall called Yurei-Daki, or the Cascade of Ghosts. Why it is so called, I do not know. Near the foot of the fall, there is a small Shinto shrine of the god of the locality, whom the people name Taki Daimyojin. And in front of the shrine is a little wooden money box to receive the offerings of the believers. And there is a story about that money box. One icy winter's evening, 35 years ago, the women and girls employed at a certain asatoriba, or hemp factory, in Kurosaka, gathered around the big brazier in the spinning room after their day's work had been done. Then they amused themselves by telling ghost stories. By the time that a dozen stories had been told, most of the gathering felt uncomfortable, and a girl cried out, just to heighten the pleasure of fear, to think of going this night, all by one's self, to the Yurei-Daki. The suggestion provoked a general scream, followed by nervous bursts of laughter. "I'll give all the hemp I spun today," mockingly said one of the party, "to the person who goes." "So will I," exclaimed another. "And I," said a third. "All of us," affirmed a fourth. Then, from among the spinners, stood up one Yasumoto Okatsu, the wife of a carpenter. She had her only son, a boy of 2 years old, snugly wrapped up and asleep on her back. "Listen," said Okatsu. "If you will all really agree to make over to me all the hemp spun today, I will go to the Yurei-Daki." Her proposal was received with cries of astonishment and of defiance, but after having been several times repeated, it was seriously taken. Each of the spinners in turn agreed to give up their share of the day's work to Okatsu, providing that Okatsu should go to the Yurei-Daki. "But how are we to know if she really goes there?" a sharp voice asked. "Why, let her bring back the money box of the god," answered an old woman, whom the spinners called Oba-san, the grandmother. "That will be proof enough." "I'll bring it," cried Okatsu, and out she darted into the street with her sleeping boy upon her back. The night was frosty, but clear. Down the empty street, Okatsu hurried, and she saw that all the house fronts were tightly closed because of the piercing cold. Out to the village and along the high road she ran, picha, picha, with the great silence of frozen rice field on either hand, and only the stars to light her. Half an hour she followed the open road. Then she turned down a narrower way, winding under cliffs. Darker and rougher the path became as she proceeded, but she knew it well, and she soon heard the dull roar of the water. A few minutes more, and the way widened into a glen, and the dull roar suddenly became a loud clamor, and before her she saw, looming against a mass of blackness, the long glimmering of the fall. Dimly she perceived the shrine, the money box. She rushed forward, put out her hand. "Oi, Okatsu-san!" suddenly called a warning voice above the crash of the water. Okatsu stood motionless, stupefied by terror. "Oi, Okatsu-san!" again pealed the voice, this time with more of menace in its tone. But Okatsu was really a bold woman. At once recovering from her stupefaction, she snatched up the money box and ran. She neither heard nor saw anything more to alarm her until she reached the high road, where she stopped a moment to take breath. Then she ran on steadily, picha, picha, till she got to Kurosaka and thumped at the door of the Asatoraba. How the women and the girls cried out as she entered, panting, with the money box of the god in her hand. Breathlessly they heard her story. Sympathetically they screeched when she told them of the voice that had called her name twice out of the haunted water. What a woman, brave Okatsu! Well had she earned the hemp. "But your boy must be cold, Okatsu," cried the Oba-san. "Let us have him here by the fire." "He ought to be hungry," exclaimed the mother. "I must give him his milk presently." "Poor Okatsu," said the Oba-san, helping to remove the wraps in which the boy had been carried. "Why, you are all wet behind." Then, with a husky scream, the helper vociferated, "Ara! It is blood!" And out of the wrappings unfastened, there fell to the floor a blood-soaked bundle of baby clothes that left exposed 2 very small brown feet and 2 very small brown hands. Nothing more. The child's head had been torn off.